Picking up on page 49, Roman numeral 11. Professional, legal, and other aspects of midwifery care. The midwife assumes responsibility for practicing in accordance with the principles and competencies outlined in this document. The midwife uses a foundation of theoretical knowledge, clinical assessment, and critical thinking skills, and shared decision making that are based on A. MANA's essential documents concerning the art and practice of midwifery. B. The purpose and goals of MANA and local, state, or provincial midwifery associations. C. Principles and practice of data collection as relevant to midwifery practice. D. Ongoing education. E. Critical review of evidence-based research findings in midwifery, practice and application as appropriate. F. Jurisdictional laws and regulations governing the practice of midwifery. G. Basic knowledge of community maternal and child health care delivery systems. H. Skills in entrepreneurship and midwifery business management. Page 50, NARM position statement regarding confidentiality. In the context of midwifery practice, confidentiality is critical to protect consumers. During midwifery care, consultation and peer review, respectful and confidential discussion may occur regarding both the midwifery consumer client and the decisions and actions of the midwife and care team. Personal and professional ethics regarding confidentiality require that someone who has learned personal details about another person refrain from sharing or discussing those details with anyone else without permission. When the person affected is not present, be respectful of them and their privacy. When personal details and private information are discussed, each person who is in contact with the information becomes responsible for upholding the confidentiality of that person's information. Contact with private information may be unintended or accidental, but the professional and ethical responsibility for maintaining confidentiality always applies. When personal details or professional actions become the subject of discussion, avoid gossip and speculation. If a person or their actions has caused concern, midwives are advised to limit discussion to areas appropriate for professional peer review. Midwives are encouraged to include discussion of their confidentiality practices as part of their informed disclosure process with clients. Midwives are advised to implement confidentiality considerations whenever client information is discussed. Complaints regarding breach of privacy or confidentiality in peer review will be addressed through the NARM grievance mechanism. Review of incidents where there has been a perceived breach of privacy or confidentiality will utilize resources such as the midwife's informed disclosure form, confidentiality agreements, informed consent documents, practice guidelines, and HIPAA privacy and security rules. HIPAA privacy and security rules, page 50. HIPAA privacy and security rules are intended to enforce standards of ethics and confidentiality. NARM recommends that all CPMs address HIPAA compliance in their professional practice and determine their status as a covered entity under HIPAA. More information on whether you are covered entity required to comply with HIPAA can be found on the hhs.gov website. NARM requires that all CPMs, even those not designated as covered entities, address the following standards for disclosure of personal health information, PHI, in their professional documents of informed disclosure, informed consent. CPMs must have permission from their clients to allow students to access medical records for the purpose of education or verification of documentation for their NARM application. CPMs must disclose to their clients that they participate in regular peer review, which can sometimes necessitate confidential disclosure of health information for the purpose of reviewing the midwife's professional conduct. More information can be found on our HIPAA for CPMs webpage at narm.org/professional-development/HIPAA, HIPAA. Page 51, informed consent and informed disclosure. Position statement on shared decision making and informed consent. The North American Registry of Midwives recognizes shared decision-making and informed consent as the cornerstones of woman-centered midwifery care. Midwives want their clients to make well-informed choices about their care. For effective informed consent, midwives provide a combination of decision-making tools, including verbal communication and well-written documents that are based on evidence-based research and the midwife's clinical expertise. The informed consent process occurs throughout care, during which the plan of care for each client is continuously explored and explained. The midwife's plan of care is based on her training, competency, practice guidelines, regional community standards of both medical and midwifery maternity care providers, and legal requirements. Informed consent documents include signed agreements when appropriate, glossary for informed disclosure and informed consent, philosophy of birth, a written or verbal explanation that a midwife provides as part of informed disclosure for midwifery care, in which the midwife explains her beliefs and opinions about the process of childbirth and the role of the midwife as care provider. Informed disclosure, a form written in language understandable to the client, which includes a place for the client to attest that she understands the content by signing her full name. The form must include a description of the midwife's training and experience, including credentials, legal status, philosophy of practice, list of services provided, transfer consultation protocols, transport plan, the NARM accountability process, and HIPAA privacy and security disclosures. CPM informed consent process includes ongoing verbal and written education about risks, benefits, and alternatives to the midwife's plan of care. Alternatives include interventions and treatments provided by the midwife as well as those available through other resources in the community, and the options of delaying or declining testing or treatment. The midwife utilizes individualized counseling based on her practice guidelines and skill level, the woman's medical history, and written documentation of a care plan that includes signatures of the client and midwife when appropriate. The informed consent process necessitates revisiting areas of consent over time and as changes occur. Midwife's plan of care. A midwife provides her clients with a care plan that is informed by her training, competency, practice guidelines, regional community standards of both medical and midwifery, maternity care providers, and legal requirements. The plan of care includes both written and verbal communication and is revisited throughout the course of care as changes occur. Education and counseling. Information and discussion components of the CPM informed consent process provided in language and understandable to the client. Verbal and written communication should be free of technical jargon that the client does not comprehend. Written information should be at the client's reading level. Shared decision making. The collaborative processes that engages the midwife and client in decision making with information about treatment options and facilitates the incorporation of client preferences and values into the plan of care. Page 52, informed disclosure for midwifery care. NARM requires that CPMs provide an informed disclosure, see definition, to all of their clients at the onset of care. Components of an informed disclosure for midwifery care. NARM requires the certified professional midwife to have a written statement of informed disclosure for midwifery care on file for each client. An informed disclosure form should be written in language understandable to the client, and there must be a place on the form for the client to attest that she understands the content by signing her full name. The signed form should be maintained in the client's chart. The form should be entitled Informed Disclosure for Midwifery Care and must include at a minimum the following. 1. A description of the midwife's education, training, and experience in midwifery. 2. The midwife's philosophy of practice. 3. Antepartum, intrapartum, and postpartum conditions requiring consultation, transfer of care, and transport to a hospital. This would reflect the midwife's written practice guidelines or availability of the midwife's written guidelines as a separate document if desired and requested by the client. 4. A medical consultation, transfer, and transport plan. 5. The services provided to the client by the midwife. 6. The midwife's current credentials and legal status. 7. NARM accountability process, including community peer review, complaint review, grievance mechanism, and how to file a complaint with NARM. And 8. HIPAA privacy and security disclosures. Informed consent for waiver of midwife's plan of care. If a midwife supports a client's choices that are outside of her plan of care, she must be prepared to give evidence of informed consent. The midwife must also be able to document the process that led to the decision and show that the client was fully informed of the potential risks and benefits of proceeding with the new care plan. It is the responsibility of the midwife to provide evidence-based information, clinical expertise, and when appropriate, consultation or referral to other providers to aid the client in the decision-making process. Information provided should be free from the personal bias of the practitioner and should be presented without coercion or intimidation. When all reasonable options have been discussed and the client understands the possible outcomes of each option, it is the client's right to choose her course of care. Depending on legal limitations, it is the CPM's right to continue care with the client or to discontinue care and provide the client with resources toward choosing other caregivers. Midwives cannot and should not knowingly put a client at harm. Continuing care with a non-compliant client must be a decision that the midwife believes is in the best interest of her client. Documentation of informed consent in the client's chart is the responsibility of the midwife. CPMs must obtain a client's signature when the client's care plan deviates from the midwife's plan of care. 53, page 53, components of an informed consent. Informed refusal if a client's care plan deviates from the midwife's plan of care. 1. Explanation of treatments and procedures. 2. Explanation of both the risks and expected benefits. 3. Discussion of possible alternative procedures, including delaying or declining of testing or treatment and their risks and benefits. 4. Documentation of any initial refusal by the client of any action, procedure, test, or screening recommended by the midwife based on her clinical opinion or required by practice guidelines, standard of care, or law and follow-up plan. 5. Client and midwife signatures and date of signing for informed refusal of standard of care. Resources for informed disclosure and informed consent. MANA core competencies. mana.org/about-us/core-competencies. NACPM standards of practice. nacpm.org/resources/NACPM-standards.pdf. Professional Ethics in Midwifery Practice. Alyssa Foster and Joan Lasser. Sample informed disclosure for midwifery care. NARM.org/WP-content/midwifery-and-HIPAA-disclosure.pdf. Page 54, CPM Practice Guidelines. All certified professional midwives are required to have written practice guidelines. In the CPM application, the candidate and her preceptor sign affidavits that the candidate has created practice guidelines, emergency care form, informed disclosure given at initiation of care, and informed consent documents used for shared decision-making during care, forms and handouts relating to midwifery practice, and an emergency care form. In the recertification application, the CPM again signs a statement verifying that she has written practice guidelines and will utilize informed consent in sharing these protocols with her clients. NARM does not require these documents be turned in with every application. Audits require candidates to send copies of their practice guidelines and other documents to the NARM application office to verify compliance with NARM standards. NARM recognizes that each midwife is an individual with specific practice protocols that reflect her own style and philosophy, level of experience, and legal status, and that practice guidelines may vary with each midwife. NARM does not set protocols for all CPMs to follow, but requires that they use their own practice guidelines in written form. Practice guidelines are a specific description of protocols that reflect the care given by a midwife, starting with the initial visit, prenatal, labor/delivery, and immediate postpartum, newborn exam, and postpartum care. Practice guidelines should include an explanation of routine care and protocols for transports. Protocols may contain absolutes such as, quote, I will not accept as a client a mother who does not agree to give up smoking, end of quotes, or may list conditions under which a midwife will make this decision, such as, quote, I will accept a client who smokes only if she agrees to cut down on smoking, maintains an otherwise exceptional diet, and reads the literature on smoking which I will provide for her, end of quote. The example concerning smoking is given only as an example and is not meant to convey that smoking must be covered in a midwife's practice protocols. Another example of a protocol could reflect action taken when a client completes 42 weeks gestation. The protocols could state that at 43.1 weeks the client will be referred to a backup physician for further care, or they could read that at 43.1 weeks the client will be given information on the risks and benefits of continuing to wait for labor and on options such as home induction or referral to a physician. It is informed consent that allows the mother and midwife to work together in developing a plan of care. Practice guidelines are the specific protocols of practice followed by a midwife, and they should reflect the midwife's model of care. Standards, values, and ethics are more general than practice guidelines, and they reflect the philosophy of the midwife. Practice guidelines are based upon the standards, values, and ethics held by the midwife. NARM recommends the midwife base the practice guidelines on documents such as the NARM written test specifications in the candidate information booklet, the MANA standards and qualifications for the art and practice of midwifery, the MANA statement of values and ethics, the MANA core competencies, ICM global standards, competencies, and tools, the midwife model of care, standards for the practice of nurse midwifery, core competencies for basic midwifery practice, code of ethics for certified nurse midwives, rules and regulations governing the practice of licensed midwifery. The midwife state, if licensed, may define the scope of practice and serve as a base for individual practice guidelines. MANA documents can be found at mana.org. Certified nurse midwife documents can be found at acnm.org. The midwife's model of care can be found at cfmidwifery.org. Page 55, NARM peer review process. NARM utilizes 3 types of peer review. Community peer review is routine, confidential, professional, non-punitive, and educational. Complaint review addresses a complaint against a certified professional midwife and may result in non-binding educational recommendations. In extreme circumstances, the NARM Accountability Committee may make additional recommendations or requirements to the midwife. Based on their findings, the Complaint Review Committee may also file a complaint with the NARM Board, which initiates the grievance mechanism. A complaint to NARM about a CPM applicant may result in additional education experience requirements or suspension or denial of a NARM application. Grievance mechanism addresses the second and subsequent complaints against a CPM or CPM applicant and may result in binding recommendations and or probation, suspension, or revocation of a CPM credential or suspension or denial of a NARM application. A CPM or CPM applicant who has been named in a written complaint to NARM is required to participate in NARM complaint review and or grievance mechanism. Failure or refusal to participate in the accountability processes will result in revocation of the credential or denial of the CPM application. Community peer review. All NARM certified professional midwives, CPMs, and CPM applicants are encouraged to attend local, routine community peer review. Community peer review brings midwives in an area together on a regular basis to discuss their cases and learn from each other. It is an opportunity for cohesiveness within a community and can serve as a foundation when difficult situations arise. Sooner or later, in every community, there will be an issue that must be faced. Establishing community peer review is worthwhile preparation for future problem solving. Having an established community peer review provides a stable environment for professional resources and support. Beyond community support lie the professional ethical concerns. Confidential peer review adds validity to the certification process and is required in many medical settings. Consumers can know that their practitioner participates in peer review and that if a concern is raised, there is a platform for discussing and follow-up. Other healthcare practitioners can also know and recognize the professionalism involved in maintaining community peer review. If a formal complaint is filed against a CPM, the first place the complaint will be addressed officially will be in local peer review, utilizing the NARM complaint review process or similar format that must include participation of the client. A formal complaint against a student/CPM applicant may be addressed by a review committee of current and previous NARM board members using NARM complaint review. See the following section, Complaint Review, for details of the complaint review process. The suggested format for community peer review is as follows. Decision making by consensus is strongly encouraged and supported by NARM. 1. Community peer review is to be held quarterly. In cases of unusual hardship in meeting, it is suggested that meetings happen at least every 6 months and that, in between meetings, the midwives involved make phone contact to discuss any difficult cases. 2. Students and assistants are included in community peer review. 3. A midwife who also facilitates the meeting hosts community peer review. This job rotates among those participating. 4. Upon arrival, each midwife writes down for the facilitator the number of cases they have to bring to review and how much time they estimate they will need to present them. 5. At the opening of the meeting, the midwife facilitating is to review the basic guidelines for community peer review as listed below. A. The information presented at community peer review is confidential. B. The intention of peer review is not punitive or critical, but supportive, educational, and community-based. Positive feedback is encouraged. Concerns should be raised respectfully and with the assumption that feedback is welcome. C. While a midwife presents a case, everyone remains quiet. Questions are asked after the midwife has finished. D. Recommendations for follow-up are made individually and or by consensus and the group offers support. 6. Each midwife states the following to the best of her ability. A. Total number of clients currently in the midwife's care. B. The number of upcoming due dates. C. How many women in the practice are postpartum. D. The number of births done since the last community peer review. E. The number of cases the midwife has to present. The midwife must present all cases involving consultation, transfer of care, transport to the hospital, instances where the midwife is outside of practice guidelines, including in these the process of informed choice that was used, and cases where the midwife requests more input from the community of midwives. It is helpful to the community if the midwife also discusses interesting cases or situations. F. The midwife then presents each case. After each case, questions may be asked and suggestions given. 7. When presenting a case, the following information should be available. A. Gravidity and parity of client along with any significant medical or OB history or psychosocial concerns. B. Relevant lab work and test results. C. Significant information regarding pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. D. Consultations with other providers, midwives, MDs, DCs, NDs, DOs, etc., and include the present care plan and how that may change with the ongoing situation. 8. After everyone 7. 8. After everyone has presented their cases and discussion has ended, the community peer review group is encouraged to discuss professional educational objectives for the current recertification period. 9. If a conflict arises between a client and a midwife, a local community peer review may discuss the details with the midwife. NARM urges the use of NARM complaint review process, which includes participation of the client whose course of care initiated the complaint. This is to be done on the most local level possible. If this cannot be achieved to the client's satisfaction and the client wishes to take action against the CPM's credential, a written complaint may be filed with the NARM board. Independent of NARM, mediation may be utilized to reach an acceptable outcome. If a complaint has already been addressed in a peer review using the NARM complaint review process or similar format and resolution was not achieved, a written complaint to the NARM board initiates the grievance mechanism. If NARM receives a complaint against a CPM or CPM applicant that has not yet been addressed in the complaint review format, NARM will initiate a complaint review at the most local level possible. See the following sections, Complaint Review and Grievance Mechanism, for details of those NARM accountability procedures. Page 57, Roman numeral 10. Some community peer review groups have decided to include an agreement regarding consensus and binding recommendations. The community peer review group may decide that the recommendation made for follow-up in instances of extreme concern need to be binding. If so, the recommendations must be reached by consensus and each participating midwife must agree to such binding decisions in the future. No recommendations are made that the other midwives would not themselves carry out. NARM disciplinary process. NARM will address complaints regarding the behavior of a certificant or applicant in which the professional behavior indicates dishonesty, inadequate informed consent, or negligent or fraudulent action of self-interest in which the midwife compromised the well-being of a client or a client's baby. Complaints must be made by someone with direct evidence of the behavior in question. This type of complaint is an external complaint and will follow the NARM complaint review process. NARM will also address complaints regarding violation of confidentiality, falsification of information on the NARM certification or recertification applications, or the misrepresentation of certification status, advertising as a CPM when the certification is inactive, has not been issued, or has been revoked. This complaint is an internal complaint and will be heard through board review, which may include participation by the NARM board, the accountability committee, and the NARM applications department. The information below details the complaint review process, grievance review process, and the appeals policies. Complaint review and grievance mechanism policy, page 57. The North American Registry of Midwives, NARM, recognizes that each certified professional midwife will practice according to his own conscience, practice guidelines, and skills levels. Certified professional midwives shall not be prevented from providing individualized care. When a midwife acts beyond her guidelines for practice, the midwife must be prepared to give evidence of informed choice. The midwife must also be able to document the process that led the midwife to be able to show that the client was fully informed of the potential negative consequences as well as the benefits of proceeding outside of practice guidelines. NARM recognizes its responsibility to protect the integrity and the value of the certification process. This is accomplished through the availability of the complaint review and grievance mechanism processes. Each certified professional midwife or CPM applicant will have the opportunity to speak to any written complaints against them before any action is taken against their certificate or application. All NARM certified professional midwives and CPM applicants are encouraged to attend local, routine community peer review. If a conflict arises between a client and a midwife, a local community peer review may discuss the details with the midwife. NARM urges the use of NARM complaint review process, which includes participation of the client whose course of care initiated the complaint. This is to be done on the most local level possible. If this cannot be achieved to the client's satisfaction and the client wishes to take action against the CPM's credential, a written complaint may be filed with the NARM board. Independent of NARM, mediation may be utilized to reach an acceptable outcome. If a complaint has already been addressed in a peer review using the NARM complaint review process or similar format, and resolution was not achieved, a written complaint to the NARM board initiates the grievance mechanism. If NARM receives a complaint against a CPM that has not yet been addressed in the complaint review format, NARM will initiate a complaint review at the most local level possible. Page 58. When NARM receives a written complaint about a CPM applicant, the complaint review or grievance mechanism is heard by a review committee of current and previous NARM board members. Peer review groups are as local as possible. If an issue becomes contentious within a local group, the peer review group may consist of midwives from a larger vicinity. Recommendations resulting from NARM complaint review are not binding. However, the midwife named in the complaint may reach resolution with the complainant by addressing the concerns expressed in complaint review. In extreme circumstances, the NARM Accountability Committee may make additional recommendations or requirements to the midwife. Based on their findings, the Complaint Review Committee may also file a complaint with the NARM board, which initiates the grievance mechanism. A second complaint against a CPM or applicant initiates the NARM grievance mechanism. A complainant who does not agree that resolution was reached with the outcome of complaint review and wishes to initiate the grievance mechanism must file a second complaint within 3 months. A second complaint may result from another complainant regarding a different course of care. The outcome of the NARM grievance mechanism is binding, and failing to meet the stated requirements results in the revocation of a CPM's credential, conditional suspension, or denial of an application. Forms for use in the NARM complaint review and grievance mechanism sessions are posted online at narm.org under the Accountability tab. Limitations of complaints for NARM complaint review and grievance mechanism. Complaints must be received within 2 years of the conclusion of care. The certification status of the CPM or CPM applicant at the time of occurrence is irrelevant. A CPM with inactive or expired status is bound by all policies regarding NARM community peer review, complaint review, and grievance mechanism. Failure to respond to a complaint will result in revocation of the credential. A complaint against a CPM or CPM applicant may only be made by a client or a party with direct knowledge of the cause for concern. A complaint will be addressed in complaint review or grievance mechanism only if the client whose course of care has prompted the complaint is willing to sign a records release. With a records release, her chart will be confidentially reviewed and discussed by the midwives participating in complaint review or grievance mechanism. Without permission to review a client's chart, the complaint is closed. NARM accountability processes work to address concerns regarding competent midwifery practice. The NARM board reserves the right to evaluate in its sole discretion the appropriate application of NARM's complaint review and grievance mechanism. Complaints received by the NARM board that do not involve issues relating to competent midwifery practice will not be addressed through the complaint review or grievance mechanism that NARM has established. A complaint to NARM against a CPM must be specific to concerns regarding competent care. NARM will not begin the processes of complaint review or grievance mechanism with a CPM or applicant who is also facing regulatory investigation or civil or criminal litigation. If a CPM faces regulatory investigation or civil or criminal litigation, the timeline for receiving complaints is extended. NARM must receive a formal complaint against a CPM within 1 year of the conclusion of regulatory or court process. If a complaint has been addressed through a mechanism provided by a local midwifery organization or local peer review, the timeline for receiving complaints is extended by 1 year from the conclusion of that process. Page 59. If a state regulatory process addresses a complaint against a CPM and the consumer brings the complaint to NARM, the appropriate NARM accountability process may be complaint review or grievance mechanism. NARM's decision regarding which process to implement depends on the consumer's previous access to participation in the complaint process. If the consumer feels she had adequate opportunity to express her concerns during the regulatory process, she may agree to proceed to the grievance mechanism rather than address her complaint through NARM complaint review. The intention of this policy is to avoid redundant peer review forms in order to access the NARM grievance mechanism. A complaint against a CPM applicant will usually include her preceptor. A complaint may be made against a midwife whose CPM certification has been revoked. NARM cannot require a midwife who is not a CPM to participate in complaint review or grievance mechanism, but participation would be a requirement of reapplication should the midwife attempt to reactivate her certification. Notice of complaints received regarding a midwife whose CPM credential has been revoked will be placed in this person's file in the applications department. The original complaint will be kept in the accountability office. Should this person reapply for a CPM credential in the future, all fees must be paid prior to NARM continuing the process appropriate to the complaint. NARM Applications Department will notify NARM Director of Accountability. The complainant will be notified and given the opportunity to pursue the original complaint. If the complainant cannot be located at that time with the information on file, the applicant may proceed with the application. The complaint may be reactivated by the complainant within 1 year of the CPM's new certification period. When NARM receives a second complaint against a CPM or applicant, the NARM grievance mechanism is initiated. A complainant who does not agree that resolution was reached with the outcome of complaint review and wishes to initiate the grievance mechanism must file a second complaint within 3 months. A second complaint may result from another complainant regarding a different course of care. The outcome of the NARM grievance mechanism is binding, and failing to meet the stated requirements results in the revocation of a CPM's credential. For a CPM applicant, failure to meet the stated requirements results in conditional suspension or denial of his application. The complaint review session. When a written complaint against a CPM or CPM applicant is received by NARM, it is referred to NARM Director of Accountability and Accountability Committee. The first step in reviewing the complaint is complaint review. In preparation for complaint review, NARM Director of Accountability provides complainant with records released to sign and return within 2 weeks. If the complainant does not return the records release within 2 weeks or does not maintain contact with NARM, the complaint is closed. Upon receipt of the signed records release, Director of Accountability contacts the CPM facing the complaint to request the CPM's practice guidelines document and a complete copy of the complainant's chart. The CPM has 1 week to provide these documents to NARM. For a complaint against a CPM, NARM Director of Accountability contacts CPMs in the area local to the complainant for 2 reasons. First, to find out if, independent of NARM, this complaint has already been addressed by complaint review or a similar process which must have included participation of the complainant among local midwives but was unable to satisfy the complainant. If so, the complaint is counted as the second complaint against the CPM and is moved to the NARM grievance mechanism. The second reason for NARM Director of Accountability to contact CPMs is to make arrangements with the CPM to chair the complaint review. The CPM who agrees to chair the complaint review must not have any conflict of interest with the CPM named in the complaint. Necessary documents are provided by NARM Director of Accountability, page 60, by NARM Director of Accountability to the complaint review chairperson. The complaint review chairperson organizes local CPMs and possibly other midwives for a NARM complaint review. The complaint review chairperson contacts the complainant and the CPM named in the complaint. A date for the complaint review is set. Participants agree to confidentiality, and copies of the necessary documents are distributed. When the local midwifery community is divided and contentious, or when a complaint is very controversial, NARM Director of Accountability may contact CPMs from a wider geographical area to identify a CPM willing to serve as complaint review chairperson. The complaint review committee may also draw participating members from a larger geographical area. In some instances, the committee may be chaired by NARM Accountability Director and consist of current and previous NARM board members and local CPMs and possibly other non-CPM midwives. For a complaint against a CPM applicant, NARM Director of Accountability organizes a complaint review with a committee of current and previous NARM board members. Because the NARM application process is confidential, participation in the complaint review committee is limited to current and previous NARM board members. When a complaint review is organized over a large geographic area, the session may occur by teleconference. If the complaint review is completed but resolution is not reached through outcome recommendations and the complainant wishes to take action against the CPM's credential, a second letter of complaint must be submitted to NARM within 3 months. Should NARM receive that second complaint against a CPM, the grievance mechanism is initiated. If another complaint on a separate incident for the same midwife is received within 10 years, the complaint goes to grievance mechanism. See the following section, grievance mechanism, for the details of the grievance mechanism process. Complaints against a CPM applicant, which are reviewed by a committee of current and previous NARM board members, may result in binding recommendations or additional application requirements. A complaint resulting in binding recommendations or additional application requirements may be appealed by the applicant but will not continue to the grievance mechanism, as there has already been an opportunity for binding recommendations to be issued. A second complaint against an applicant may not involve the same incident. However, a second complaint resulting from a different incident against an applicant is addressed by a committee of current and previous NARM board members through NARM's grievance mechanism. The format for NARM complaint review is as follows. NARM Director of Accountability provides the complaint review chairperson with copies of this document, the NARM complaint review conclusion and summary forms, the written complaint letter, and the midwife's chart and practice guidelines, which were supplied upon request by the midwife named in the complaint. The members of the complaint review committee read these documents, contacting NARM Director of Accountability with questions. Each member makes a list of questions and points of concern that they intend to address to the midwife during the complaint review session. A group discussion of these questions and areas of concern is held prior to the opening of the complaint review session. During the complaint review session, the testimony and presentation of events may answer these questions and concerns, or they may be asked directly. The midwife and complainant are notified to schedule the complaint review session. If necessary, additional written or oral testimony is arranged for the scheduled session by the midwife and complainant. Page 61. The complaint review session is begun with the midwife, complainant, and review members present. During the complaint review session, the complainant and the CPM may each include first-hand accounts of supporting testifiers, either in person or by written testimony. In addition, for the purpose of emotional support during the complaint or grievance review session, the complainant and the CPM may each include the company of a spouse, significant other, parent, close family member, close friend, or clergy. All parties agree to uphold confidentiality. The agenda for the session is read. The complainant is read aloud, or the complainant may tell her story. The complainant gives testimony, and any additional testimony on the complainant's behalf is given or read. Reviewers may ask questions of the complainant and supporting testifiers. The complainant and supporting testifiers are excused. The midwife presents the case. Supporting testimony is given or read. Reviewers may ask questions of the midwife and supporting testifiers. The midwife is excused from proceedings. Reviewers discuss the case. Recommendations and findings are written and sent to NARM Director of Accountability. Based on their findings, the Complaint Review Committee may also file a complaint with the NARM Board, which initiates the grievance mechanism. NARM Director of Accountability presents the outcome of the complaint review to the NARM Board. In extreme circumstances, the NARM Board may make additional recommendations or requirements to the midwife. NARM Director of Accountability issues a formal outcome letter from NARM to the CPM facing the complaint and the complainant. A copy is sent to the complaint review chairperson. NARM continuing education certificates are issued to the members of the Complaint Review Committee. 61. The grievance mechanism session. A second complaint may result from another complainant regarding a different course of care as part of an outcome from complaint review, or from a complainant who does not agree that resolution was reached with the outcome of complaint review. A complainant who is unsatisfied with the outcome of the complaint review and wishes to take action against a CPM's credential may initiate the grievance mechanism by submitting a second letter of complaint to NARM. The second letter of complaint must be filed within 3 months of the date on the complaint review outcome notification letter. The outcome of the NARM grievance mechanism is binding, and failing to meet the stated requirements results in the revocation of a CPM's credential. An applicant may receive conditional suspension or denial of an application. The grievance mechanism may result in probation, suspension, or revocation of the CPM credential. The NARM grievance mechanism is heard by a committee of current and previous NARM board members, grievance committee, via teleconference. In preparation for grievance mechanism session, NARM Director of Accountability provides complainant with records released to sign and return within 2 weeks unless NARM has already secured the required documents during the complaint review process. If the complainant does not return the records release or does not maintain contact with NARM, the complaint is closed. Upon receipt of the signed records release, Director of Accountability contacts the CPM facing the complaint to request the CPM's practice guidelines document and a complete copy of the complainant's chart. The CPM has 1 week to provide these documents to NARM. Page 62. The opposing sides are each invited to supply written or verbal testimony for consideration during the grievance mechanism. NARM Director of Accountability provides copies of necessary documents to the grievance committee members. Complainant must respond within 2 weeks of being notified by NARM Director of Accountability with attempts to establish a date for the grievance mechanism session. If the complainant does not continue participation in the process, the complaint is dropped and will not reflect on the CPM or CPM applicant in question. NARM Director of Accountability serves as chairperson of the session. The format for NARM grievance mechanism session is as follows. 1. All participants are required to sign confidentiality and no conflict of interest statements at the opening of the teleconference. These statements are verbally reaffirmed. 2. The agenda is drawn from this session format and the material to be presented. Chairperson reads agenda and asks for questions regarding the process of the session. 3. Written testimony will be read and verbal testimony given by the complainant. The midwife is urged to be present during this time but may not address the complainant during the session or comment during the complainant's presentation. During the grievance mechanism session, the complainant and the CPM may each include first-hand accounts of supporting testifiers, either in person or by written testimony. In addition, for the purpose of emotional support during the complaint or grievance review session, the complainant and the CPM may each include the company of a spouse, significant other, parent, close family member, close friend, or clergy. Grievance committee asks questions of complainant for clarification. 4. Complainant is excused from the proceedings. 5. The midwife in question will present his chart and respond to the testimony provided by the complainant. Then the CPM or applicant is excused. 6. The grievance committee discusses the testimonies heard and continues to review the documentation. Suggestions are made for formal recommendations, requirements, and/or actions against the CPM's credential. 7. The grievance committee derives appropriate action after the discussion and recommendations are considered. NARM's intention in the grievance mechanism is to provide educational guidelines and support where appropriate. Punitive action is only taken when further action is deemed necessary. Actions are decided by consensus. Actions are limited to the following possibilities. A. Midwife is found to have acted appropriately and no action is taken against the CPM. If the review process has not resolved the dispute, concerned parties are urged to seek professional mediation. B. Midwife is required to study areas outlined by the grievance committee. Upon completion of the assigned study, the midwife will submit a statement of completion to the Director of Accountability. C. Midwife is placed on probation and given didactic and/or skills development work to address the areas of concern. The midwife must find a mentor, approved by the grievance committee, to follow the assigned studies and lend support in improving the areas of weakness. The mentor will report to the Director of Accountability regarding the progress and fulfillment of the probation requirements. While on probation, the midwife may be required to attend births with a more experienced midwife assisting. D. Midwife certification is suspended and the CPM is prohibited from practicing as a primary midwife for a period of time during which the CPM is mentored by another midwife and focuses on specified areas of study. The mentor midwife will report progress to the Director of Accountability. Upon completion of required study and/or experience, the CPM is free to practice independently as primary midwife. If a midwife on suspension is found to be in deliberate violation of suspension guidelines, this CPM risks certificate revocation. E. In the case of dishonesty, refusal to inform, negligent or fraudulent action of self-interest in which the CPM or applicant compromised the well-being of a client or client's baby, or non-compliance with the grievance mechanism, this CPM certificate must be revoked or the CPM application must be denied. Midwives with revoked certificates may reapply for certification after 2 years. This application must include the full fee. Prior to recertification, all outstanding complaints must be resolved, including the completion of previous grievance mechanism requirements. A midwife with a denied application may reapply after meeting all requirements resulting from the review process. F. If the case involves the abuse of a controlled substance, the certified midwife or applicant in question will be required to participate in a rehabilitation program in addition to the above possible outcomes. Proof of participation and release will be necessary for full certification reinstatement or for an applicant to continue in the CPM application process. 8. The midwife in question is notified of findings and appropriate action taken. Public notice of revocation is made and remains posted online at narm.org unless recertification is completed. 9. The complainant is notified of action taken regarding the midwife. If no action is taken, a compassionate approach is taken to honor the complainant's perspective. Accountability appeals process. An appeal of the complaint review will be for the complaint to move to the grievance mechanism for resolution by the NARM Accountability Committee. An appeal of a decision of the grievance mechanism may be made by either the complainant or the midwife. An appeal will only be considered if either party has significant new information that was not available during the grievance review or has substantial allegations of a conflict of interest by a person who participated in the grievance review that adversely affected the decision. The appeal with documentation should be submitted in writing within 30 days of notification of the decision. If the Accountability Committee determines that the appeal is warranted, the grievance will be heard again by members of the Accountability Committee, which will include at least 2 members who did not participate in the first hearing. NARM policy for printing notice of CPM revocation. NARM will print public notification of a midwife's CPM revocation on the NARM website. The notification will be printed as follows. The North American Registry of Midwives Board has revoked the CPM credential from midwife's name. Midwife's name may no longer refer to herself as a NARM CPM, certified professional midwife, or CPM, and is advised to honestly and responsibly inform current and prospective clients that her CPM credential has been revoked. According to the candidate information booklet, quote, in the case of dishonesty, refusal to inform, negligent or fraudulent action of self-interest in which the certified midwife compromised the well-being of a client or client's baby, or with non-compliance to the NARM grievance mechanism, this CPM certificate must be revoked, end of quote. Page 64. After 2 years, the midwife may reapply for NARM certification by sending a letter of intent to the NARM Accountability Committee. Once approved, the applicant will be required to 1. Satisfy all previous requirements originating from peer review findings prior to reinstatement. 2. Satisfy any complaints that may have been received during the period of revocation. New complaints must be heard by peer review and documented to the NARM Accountability Committee before a new application can be submitted. 3. Submit a new NARM certified professional midwife application including all fees. Clinical submitted on the new application must have occurred after the date of revocation. 4. Pass the NARM examination. The board may decide to implement an initial period of probation during which additional education or documentation requirements must be met. Failure to meet these requirements could result in suspension or revocation. NARM may suspend or revoke the reinstated CPM credential through the NARM grievance mechanism. A second revocation is permanent. Grievance mechanism flow of activity. Conflict. Local peer review. If no resolution, complaint to NARM board. NARM Accountability Committee. Notifies midwife, notifies complainant. Grievance mechanism proceedings, recommendations of grievance mechanism, NARM Accountability Committee resolution. Page 65 glossary is used in this process. The following terms shall have the meaning given to them except where the context clearly states otherwise. The terms defined herein are specific to the CPM process. Accountability, the check and balance system built into the certification process. Accountability includes continuing education, informed consent, peer review, complaint review, and the grievance mechanism. ACNM, American College of Nurse Midwives, the professional association that represents certified nurse midwives, CNMs, and certified midwives, CMs, in the United States. AMCB, American Midwifery Certification Board, assistant under supervision, a student midwife who is being taught to perform the skills of a midwife through hands-on clinical experience and gradually increasing degrees of responsibility. Audit, a methodical examination and review of application materials, including any additional requested materials such as practice documents and charts. Audits may be conducted randomly or for multiple discrepancies on any application type, including recertification applications. Birth center, a facility, institution, or place not normally used as a residence, which is not an ambulatory surgical center or a hospital or in a hospital, in which births are planned to occur in a home-like setting. CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Approved CPR courses include the American Heart Association, the Red Cross, and American Safety and Health Institute, ASHI Basic Life Support. CNM, Certified Nurse Midwife, an advanced practice registered nurse who has specialized education and training in both the disciplines of nursing and midwifery and is certified by the AMCB. CM, Certified Midwife, a direct entry midwife who is certified by the AMCB. Certified Professional Midwife, CPM, a professional independent midwifery practitioner who has met the standards for certification set by the North American Registry of Midwives, NARM, and adheres to the midwives' model of care. CEU, Continuing Education Unit. Continuing education units, which are usually represented as credit hours, but sometimes as units. For NARM recertification, 1 contact hour equals 1 CEU. Charts, a record of information about a client. Complete charts include the prenatal care record, labor and delivery records, newborn exam record, and postpartum record. Client code, each client must have a unique code. If there is more than one birth, including twins, with any given client, there must be a different code assigned for each subsequent birth. If a preceptor has more than one student applicant, each chart must have a code that all students will use. Students should not develop different codes for the same client. Clinical, any direct observation or evaluation of a client, e.g. a birth, prenatal, postpartum, or newborn exam. Clinical experience, any experience involving direct observation or evaluation of a client and signed for by a witness or registered preceptor. Glossary continued. Complaint review, a group review by CPMs conducted locally regarding a formal complaint filed against a CPM within 24 months of the conclusion of care or with the time allowed by NARM policy. Complaint review includes participation of the client whose course of care initiated the complaint and may result in non-binding educational recommendations for the midwife or initiation of the NARM grievance mechanism. Confidentiality, the protection of individually identifiable information, specifically client information. Continuing education, keeping up with new developments in the field of midwifery, upgrading skills, acquiring new information, and reviewing skills and knowledge. Reviewing skills and knowledge. Continuity of care, COC. Care provided throughout prenatal, intrapartum, and postpartum periods. For the purposes of the NARM application, primary under supervision care must be provided for a minimum of 5 prenatals spanning at least 2 trimesters, the birth, including the placenta, the newborn exam, and at least 2 postpartums. Transports are not accepted for continuity of care births. Co-primary, a midwife who shares care of a client with another midwife, with each midwife bearing equal responsibility for the actions, inactions, and collective decisions. Core competencies. The Midwives Alliance of North America. Core competencies, a document of guidelines which establish the essential knowledge, clinical skills, and critical thinking necessary for entry-level midwifery practice, providing the basis for the CPM credential. Currency, documentation of additional births and/or clinicals which may be required for applications that have been in process for an extended period of time. Minimum required clinical experiences must span no longer than 10 years, with at least 10 out-of-hospital births within the last 3 years. Education and counseling, information and discussion of components of the CPM informed consent process and shared decision-making, provided in verbal and written language understandable to the client. Eligibility, process by which one may seek and obtain certification based upon personal, program, organization, state, or international qualifications. Emergency care form, a form individualized for each client, which should include the client's name, address, phone number, hospital chosen for transport with telephone number, name and contact information of anyone who may be involved in the care of the client, such as client doctors or the backup physician or the midwife, and any person that the client lists as an emergency contact. Expired CPM, one who has previously been issued the CPM credential, but within 90 days after his expiration date has not provided documentation and maintaining the requirements of recertification. Expired application, an application which has been submitted to the NARM Applications Department and has been in process or incomplete for longer than the allowed time frame. Fetal neonatal death, a death from 20 weeks intrauterine gestational age to 28 days old. Grievance mechanism, the process used by the NARM Accountability Committee to handle formal complaints about a midwife, which is put into effect once a second complaint against a CPM or applicant is filed. The outcome is binding, and failing to meet the stated requirements results in the revocation of a CPM's credential, conditional suspension, or denial of an application. An active CPM, voluntary suspension of CPM credential on an annual basis not to exceed 6 years, during which time the use of the CPM credential is prohibited. Inactive CPMs are also prohibited from serving as a NARM registered preceptor unless registered as a preceptor using another credential. Glossary continued, page 67. Informed consent form, a midwife's documentation of the process leading to the decision made by a client that is outside the midwife's plan of care, which must include evidence that the client was fully informed of the potential risk and benefits of proceeding with the new care plan. Informed consent process, ongoing verbal and written education about risks, benefits, and alternatives to the midwife's plan of care. The midwife utilizes individualized counseling based on her practice guidelines and skill level, the client's medical history, and written documentation of a care plan that includes signatures of the client and midwife when appropriate. The informed consent process necessitates revisiting areas of consent and non-consent over time and as changes occur. Informed disclosure, a form written in language understandable to the client, which includes a place for the client to attest that she understands the content by signing her full name. The form must include a description of the midwife's training and experience, including credentials, legal status, philosophy of practice, list of services provided, transfer consultation protocols, transport plan, the NARM accountability process, and HIPAA privacy and security disclosures. Initial prenatal exam, intake interview, history, medical, gynecological, family, and physical examination. Information may be gathered over one or more early prenatals and should include both an oral written history and a general overview of normal physical condition. Licensed midwife, a midwife who is legally recognized and regulated by her state. MANA Midwives Alliance of North America, MANA. MEAC, M-E-A-C, Midwifery Education Accreditation Council. Mediation, process utilizing a third agreed upon party to bring about agreement or reconciliation among disputing parties. Mentor, see NARM, registered preceptor. Midwife, one who attends a woman in childbirth as the primary care provider. Midwife's plan of care, a care plan provided by the midwife to her client that is informed by her training, competency, practice guidelines, regional community standards of both medical and midwifery maternity care providers, and legal requirements. The plan of care includes both written and verbal communication and is revisited throughout the course of care as changes occur and at the time an exam or procedure is provided. A client may refuse a procedure at any time. NARM, North American Registry of Midwives. NARM, registered preceptor. NARM, registered preceptor, a midwife who meets requirements for supervising CPM candidates and has current approved registration through NARM. The registered preceptor must be credentialed as a certified professional midwife, CPM, certified nurse midwife, CNM, certified midwife, CM, or must be a licensed practitioner legally recognized by a state jurisdiction to provide maternity care. A preceptor must have an additional 3 years of experience after credentialing or 50 primary, co-primary births beyond entry-level CPM requirements. Additionally, they must also have 10 continuity of care births beyond entry-level CPM requirements. The preceptor must have attended a minimum of 10 out-of-hospital births in the last 3 years. Neonatal resuscitation. Courses must be approved by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Canadian Pediatric Society, or pre-approved by NARM. Courses must be approved for use in the U.S. or Canada. Newborn exam, a complete and thorough examination of the infant conducted within 12 hours of the birth. Glossary continued, page 68. Observer, one who is physically present and observes the labor and birth other than their own. OOC, out of country, specifically midwifery training conducted outside the U.S. or Canada. Out of hospital birth, a birth in a home, freestanding birth center, or other location not connected to a hospital. Peer review, process utilized by midwives to confidentially discuss client cases in a professional forum which includes support, feedback, follow-up, and learning objectives. PEP-EL, portfolio evaluation process. Entry level, the application route through which midwifery apprenticeship with one or more registered preceptors is thoroughly documented for review for the purpose of qualifying for the CPM credential. PEP-EM, portfolio evaluation process. Experienced midwife, the application route through which a midwife's experience, a minimum of 5 years of experience beyond training, is thoroughly documented for review for the purpose of qualifying for the CPM credential. This application route was discontinued December 31st, 2019. Phase 1. The first of 4 phases of the PEP-EL application requiring documentation of births attended as an observer. Phase 1 serves as an orientation to a preceptor's practice. Phase 2, the second of 4 phases of the PEP-EL application requiring documentation of midwifery clinical experience as an assistant under supervision. Phase 2 provides the applicant with appropriate instruction and training in preparation for providing primary midwifery care under the direct supervision of a registered preceptor during Phase 3. Phase 3, the third of 4 phases of the portfolio evaluation process, entry level, PEP-EL application requiring documentation of midwifery clinical experience as a primary under supervision, verification of skills, CPR, NRP certifications, verification of utilization of practice documents, and references. Phase 4, the fourth of 4 phases of the PEP-EL application requiring documentation of additional births as a primary under supervision, Phase 4 must be submitted within 6 months of passing the NARM examination. Philosophy of birth, a written or verbal explanation that a midwife provides as part of informed disclosure for midwifery care, in which the midwife explains his beliefs and opinions about the process of childbirth and the role of the midwife as care provider. Plan of care, see midwife's plan of care. Planned hospital birth, a birth plan for the hospital setting prior to the onset of labor. Postpartum exam, a physical, nutritional, and socio-psychological review of the mother and baby after 24 hours and up to 6 weeks following the birth, and does not include the immediate postpartum exam. Practice guidelines, a specific description of protocols that reflect the care given by a midwife, including the initial visit, prenatal, labor, delivery, immediate postpartum, newborn exam, and postpartum care. Practice guidelines should include an explanation of both routine care and protocols for transports. Preceptor, see NARM registered preceptor. Prenatal exam, a complete and thorough routine examination, counseling and education of the pregnant woman prior to birth. Glossary continued, page 69. Primary, a midwife who has full responsibility for provision of all aspects of midwifery care, prenatal, intrapartum, newborn, and postpartum, without the need for supervisory personnel. Primary under supervision, a student midwife who provides all aspects of care as if they were in practice, although the supervising midwife has primary responsibility and is present in the room during all care provided. For primary under supervision births, this includes labor management, the birth including the placenta, and immediate postpartum care. Protocols, see practice guidelines. Recertification, the process through which a CPM renews credentialing every 3 years by documenting CEUs. Peer review, cultural awareness, and current CPR NRP certifications. Recertification after expiration, the process through which an expired CPM may reapply for the CPM credential by documenting birth experience, CEUs, peer review, cultural awareness, and current CPR NRP certifications. The expired CPM will be required to retake the written examination unless they hold another current credential, such as a state license recognized by NARM. Registered midwife, see licensed midwife. Registered preceptor, see NARM registered preceptor. Security guidelines, standards that ensure quality, proctorship, and confidentiality at test sites. Shared decision making, the collaborative process that engages the midwife and client in decision making with information about treatment options and facilitates the incorporation of client preferences and values into the plan of care. Standards of practice, see practice guidelines. State license, see licensed midwife. Supervisor, see NARM registered preceptor. Transport, transfer of care during labor to another primary caregiver, including labor management, the birth including the placenta, and immediate postpartum care. In the case of transfer, the student must remain with the client through the birth if possible and continue to be present through the immediate postpartum period. The supervising preceptor must be present until transfer of care has occurred. Trimesters, first trimester is conception to 13 weeks, 6 days. Second trimester is 14 weeks, 0 days to 27 weeks. 6 days. Third trimester is 28 weeks, 0 days to the birth. Witness, anyone other than the applicant present at a birth. Written examination, North American Registry of Midwives, written examination. Page 70 of 70, directory, narm.org, NARM general information, 888-842-4784, extension 1, voice. Email, info@narm.org, NARM Applications Department, P.O. Box 420, Summertown, Tennessee 38483, 888-842-4784, extension 2, voice. Applications at narm.org. NARM fax for all departments, 888-842-4784. Midwives Alliance in North America, MANA, 844-626-2674. Email info@mana.org. MANA www.mana.org. Midwifery Education Accreditation Council, MEAC, MEEK, email info@meekschools.org, website www.meekschools.org.